living on a consciousness info. Sa.neter TV7. You keep it hot 24/7. You got that life for 102. Sa.neter TV2. Yeah.
You are now inside sa.neter Studios, the House of Consciousness production. Black news presentation. Sa.neter. Sa.neter.
Time to set the stage with the lights off. Let the little nigga breathe till the fight's lost. You ain't never like the room with the bright sauce. Hail Mary, they despise what the light brought. Let them roach niggas bleed if they can't see. Sa.neter TV, what you can't be. They say that murder on my mind, now they can't breathe. Take a picture of the crew, that's your last peep. Oh, I need me your love, yeah, that's just me. Keep them jumping like some frogs, so they might be leave with the sunset. And they don't really wanna bleed from the gunplay. And like mine, niggas smoking weed on the one-way street, nigga. Yeah, we see we outside with it. Pull up to debates like we might be with it on God. Side these niggas like bullshit and they fraud. Let me chop them down with the sword. Walk them down like they little boys. This the toughest you gon' be in, we too hard. And you don't really want that smoke, my G. With deep sa.neter.
Can I say that from Captain Zariak? From the Hebrew Israelite community. Captain Zariak is not the only one that's asked this question. I think that it's possible that the fervor of his need for the question perhaps came from my opening discussion with Zion Lex, which is unfortunate because I never even got a chance to respond to what he said, and I'm going to tell you that the responses would just blow that out of the water very easily. But what I want to do is I want to deal with one of the questions that I continually hear. And one of the questions is, who created Maat? Who created Maat? Sometimes the Hebrew Israelites and others who are Christian or even in any of the Abrahamic traditions, they say, well, listen, our laws came from a particular individual who has been named. We know that Moses brought our laws. We know that those things came from a particular place and a particular person. And I want to start by saying that one of the major tensions that we have between the Kemetic and the Hebrew Israelite community, and even the Christian community, all of the Abrahamic communities, not just the Hebrew Israelites, is that, and you've heard me say this, family, those people in those communities are extremely literal, they're extremely linear, and they're not able to deal with myth. In fact, sometimes when you tell them they're not able to deal with myth, they'll say, oh no, I know that things in the Bible are allegory and things in the Bible are fact, but the reality is they only say that things are allegory when it suits them. They don't actually deal with the fact that most of what they're reading is allegory.
Right.
And so what I want you to listen to, and I'm going to give you one quote, family. I could give you literally hundreds of them. But listen to this quote by Moore and Kelly. They say, most histories of ancient Israel are no longer considered information about the Egyptian sojourn, the Exodus, and the wilderness wanderings recoverable. Oops, wait, I just lost it, because my computer went to sleep. And I want to make sure that you hear, that you see this. Okay. Recoverable or even relevant to Israel's emergence. Most important is the fact that no clear extra-biblical evidence exists, thank you, for any aspect of the Egyptian sojourn, Exodus, or wilderness wanderings. The lack of evidence, combined with the fact that most scholars believe, listen to this carefully, that believe that these stories are about events to have been written centuries after the apparent setting of the stories, leads historians to admit that by normal, critical, historical means, these events cannot be placed in a specific time or correlated with other known history, or claim that these stories are believable historically on the basis of inference, potential connections, and general plausibility. What are they saying here? I hope you understand what's being said here, family. Now, it has been over 100 years now that people who are looking for the history of the Torah and of the Bible have been searching for it. In fact, there's one group called the Biblical Exodus Society, I believe, that actually comes out of Britain that has spent millions of dollars and spent over 100 years looking for it. They have now recognized that they cannot find any proof of a story of an exodus of the people of the Israelites from Kemet. Why is this important? I want you to understand that historians for 40 years now, historians who could be considered, I think that's the only one I'm going to read, because I'm going to go basically now. Historians who consider themselves Israeli historians, historians who consider themselves Hebrew historians, even in fact biblical historians, actually say now that all of the patriarchs are mythological. I'm talking about Abraham. Abraham did not come from Ur or Chaldea. By the way, the Bible says Chaldea, but we know that that land wasn't called Chaldea until much later. We know that they talk about a sojourn on camels. We know that camels weren't even introduced into the area until much later. We now know that they spoke the same language as the people of Canaan, that they worshiped the same gods as the people of Canaan. We know that they came out of Canaan. And so what has happened is we understand now that Abraham, that Moses, that David, that Joshua, that these individuals that are seminal to the biblical story are now mythological characters. Now I want to be really clear. Some of you are going to be really upset that I said that, and that's fine. But I want you to understand that saying something is mythological is not necessarily saying something negative. We have to stop making our spiritual text like newspapers. We have to stop making our spiritual text literal histories, and then saying that if the history didn't occur as it did in that book, that means that that book should be discarded. That means that that book is a lie. That is not what myth is. You've heard me say this before, family. History is what happened once, what someone did once. Myth is what you should always be doing. Myth, in some sense, is a higher vibration than history. So if you want to mythologize the story of a sojourn and exodus of the Hebrew people from Kemet, and recognize that they're not talking about something that actually happened, they're talking about what you must do when you're in the face of great power and how you can be victorious, then I can rock with you. I'm okay with that. But once you begin to make it historical, you will have problems. And even more when you're trying to make a story that's mythological, historical, and you're actually speaking ill of your ancestors, then you have even more problems. You've heard me say that when you go against your ancient African ancestors, you will lose. And I don't think that our folks understand that. So I want to give that background to the question of the origin of Maat. So if you look here, you're actually going to see a papyrus that describes an interaction between, if you look at this ruler right here, this ruler is actually the ruler that most people are familiar with, Ramses the Great, Ramesses II, Ramesses Meriamun, Usar Maat Ra Sertepen Ra. That's who this gentleman is here. And here, I'm going to skip this character here for a second. Here you're actually seeing his beautiful wife, Nefertari. And they are actually walking with who? Maat. Now let's be clear. Ramesses' name, in fact, two of his names, for those of you who don't know, most rulers in Kemet actually had at least 5 names. Notice in the Bible, not even one is given. And that's because they were not trying to tell you a history in the classical sense. They were trying to give you a sense of how these people bubbled up from the rest of the people in the region. That's what they were attempting to do. But unfortunately, after the 3rd century AD, CE, what happened is people who wanted to take control of this Christian movement, people who wanted, these are European people who wanted to actually put themselves in a position where they would be in power, they made the story literal. That's what happened. And so that's what we're dealing with right now. That's the reason why you've heard me say to my dear Hebrew Israelite brothers that the chains are no longer on your wrist, but they're still on the soul. On your soul. And what you have to do is you have to remove the Tomhu, remove the European from your soul. And as long as the European is there, you can speak as revolutionary as you want. You can talk about how you're confronting white people all day long, but the reality is the white man is now inside you. Remove him, and then you'll be able to move forward. So, the character that you see in between Ramesses and Nefertari is actually Maat. This is Maat here. Her name is not issued in what some of you know as a cartouche. I don't use the word cartouche. It's a French word. It actually is a French word for bullet cartridge. When Napoleon took his French soldiers to Kemet, they saw these things and they recognized that the names of rulers were in them, and they thought it looked like the cartridge that they held their bullets in. And so they called these cartouches. Brothers and sisters, if you think that the names of your African ancestors have been encased in the symbol of death, then maybe that's why they're not intervening on your behalf while you're catching hell in 2017 in the United States. What you need to do is recognize that this is called a shen. And a shen is a symbol of everlasting life. So your ancestors have encased their names in a symbol of everlasting life. If you recognize that functional spiritual concept, then maybe they would still be here and they'd be able to assist you. So the names of humans are in the shen, but the name of the deity is not, because our ancestors were always clear that we were not talking about a person who was a human. By the way, here is, right here, the name for Maat. That's the name for Maat. You'll even see that it has a determinative at the end that tells you they're talking about a female deity. You see this image of a woman who is seated with an ankh on her leg? This tells you that they're talking about a female deity, and this says Maat. You'll even see the sickle. Anyway, not going to go too far into the language, but I want you to understand that that is who you're seeing. This is Maat. Maat is a divine character. She's not a literal person. And so I want to get to the question that we've gotten from Brother Tsariak where he actually asked me who created Maat. Right. Where did Maat come from? And I need you to understand that in some of the oldest texts, we see, for example, the text that we even see sometimes Michael Edwards read, where he talks about Ra and the creation of the world. By the way, Michael Edwards, I'm coming to you. I'm coming for you. You think you're ready, but you're really not ready. But so in that story, you hear how Ra is creating the world. Now, you can substitute different names sometimes. I'll get back to that in a second. But understand that as the world is being created, what happens? They say that Maat is with them. According to the Kemetic understanding of the world, Maat has no origin. Maat is the order, the principle, the stuff of the universe. So when the universe is created, Maat is in existence. That is how we view Maat. So maybe you're actually saying, well, who was the first person to describe Maat? And I'm going to honestly say to you, we don't know. We don't actually know. I'm going to tell you that the oldest texts are about Maat. The oldest complete book, the Maxims of Ptahhotep, talks about how to live a Ma'atical life. And so we should understand that Maat is very old. Very, very old. I can tell you the first text that we found with her, but that doesn't mean that that was when she was first devised, when wise priests and priestesses sat down and said, how do we describe our relationship to the rest of the world?
So let me ask you.
Yes.
So I'm getting it. I get it. I understand fully. Just like when you ask the Muslims, who created Allah? They say, who created Allah has always been here. You see? So if they can say that and nobody challenges that, how come you can't understand the root of all of this before Islam, before Christianity? So when we say Maat has always been here, you can't create Maat. Maat is and always will be. You see what I'm saying?
And I want to say this. They often do that, even when they talk about their Bible. Sometimes when they're talking to you and they think they're talking about history, all they've read is their Bible, like their Bible is a history book, right? I don't want to do that with Maat in this instance. I'm a priest and I'm also a historian. I'm talking to you primarily as a historian. I can't tell you the actual date that the first person issues the word Maat, the term Maat. I can't tell you that. I'm going to tell you that it probably long predates 2300 BCE. I'm telling you that Maat, at least in written form, is older than 4,000 years old. And likely, Maat is even from an earlier source, because we know that when the Kemetic people begin to actually write and describe some of their ceremonies, they're describing ceremonies. In order for you to describe a ceremony, you have to have had an understanding of the characters, the mythological characters who were in your ceremony. So just because you can find the earliest text that mentions this person, clearly that individual, that divine character, has to be older. Please understand this. It's almost like me saying to you, family, because I know that some of my Hebrew Israelite brothers are going to try to dither on this. It's almost like me saying, I'm watching the stars show Power, right? And when I look at Power and I look at the first day that Power aired, then that must be the creation of the main character whose name is Ghost. But we know that the person who wrote the script must have been thinking about Ghost before the first airing.
Oh, I see you be looking at Power.
I'm into Power.
Me too.
I'm into Power. I'm addicted to Power. Oh yeah, I do.
Yeah.
And I also know that the main character is a fraternity brother, so you know.
Yeah.
So I want you to understand that this is a situation where logically you should understand that Maat is older than the first thing that we see written about Maat. She's much older than that. I can't tell you exactly how old. Perhaps younger scholars who are watching this will be motivated to do more work in Kemet and will actually find older text, will actually find older images of Maat. So all I can tell you is that she's very old, much older than the text you're talking about, by the way. Much older than. Now, here's the deal. We can tell you when we think that the Torah and the Bible were written. First off, when they tell you, oh, the Torah maybe comes from 700 AD or 700 BCE or 300 BCE or wherever they tell you. When you say, well, that's the date, they say, oh, no, wait, but it must be older. But then when I'm talking to you about Ma'at, they don't like to deal with that reality. Because once again, they are willing to deal with an allegory when it suits them, but then they want to render something as fact when it suits them. Just like when we're talking to Brother Tazariak, he said that his creation story is not a myth. He said that to us, which actually means that he must believe that the world was created in 6 days. And on the sixth day, there was rest. He must actually believe that a woman was taken from a rib. He actually tried to say to us, and he said this when we talked on 125th Street, he actually said that the scientific story that I have studied mirrors their biblical story. Folks, if that's a mirror, just because I'm telling you that there was a period in time when all people are related to one African woman, and you say, well, that's what we see in the Bible. Brother, if that's the case, then almost every creation story is fact, because most creation stories have the world being started by two human beings. So what exactly are you saying? Just because you see one thing that's similar, please don't mean that means that your story is actually historical fact. This is the problem with simply reading one book. By the way, that book was created by humans. We know that it was written over 1,000 years, and there may be as many as 200 authors. We actually believe now, historians actually believe now, that the Torah was written by people who had different aims, people who used the word Yahweh, people who used the word Jehovah. Those are different groups of people, and those texts were actually put together, and they attempted to make it seem seamless. But the fact that they're using different names, some historians are now arguing, proves to us that there were different groups of people who began to tell those stories, who didn't see things exactly the same way. So I want you to, and also Elohim. In fact, I think they call it the JYE theory. So I want you to understand that there's an origin to things. I'm not talking about myth, where Maat is here from the beginning of time. I'm talking about when someone actually decided to call this beautiful African goddess with the ostrich feather on her head Maat. Now I'm talking as a historian. And so if you want to deal with history, you got to deal with history. If I ask you when the Torah was written and you say, well, we know the Torah came down from the beginning of time, then you're now not dealing with history anymore. And I have the ability as a Kemetic priest to deal with both myth and history. When I ask you a historical question, don't give me a mythological answer. And when I ask you a mythological answer, don't give me a historical question. You have to understand that these are different genres of writing. There are some things that actually occurred in history, and there are other things that were devised by wise people to tell us how to live. That is where you're wrong, because once again, you are being too literal. By the way, all of the scholars, the biblical scholars, no longer reduce this to literalism. So let me also get to the other question he asked. He also asked, well, what about Horus? He uses Horus instead of Heru, by the way, which is a Greek name. Anubis, which is also a Greek name. Anubis should be Anpu. Maat and Geb, were they real characters? He said that he knew that it was BS that people, when they died, would see these characters. So if they aren't real, then it's BS. Brother, you are being literal. Once more. You're being literal. Do you actually think that you're going to stand in front of some pearly gates and Peter is going to let you in? What do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? We have to deal with the fact that we are talking about, then they have a problem. Because we haven't found the gates.
Brother, not all.
Right.
But they really, literally believe that, brother. Captain Tazariak literally believed, and he said it, that the sky is going to crack open and thousands of men with chariots and horses is going to come from the sky, Brother Jabari. You probably never heard him say that, did you? If I'm going to dig it, brother, I'm going to get it, and I'm going to get it up on my video. I got to look for it, and I'm going to share that with you. So I'm telling you, brother, they literally, not they, just the Messianic Hebrews, like my brother Hashar, Daniel Allah, Captain Cesare, them brothers that you see dressed up and suited and booted out there. Right. They literally believe that story.
Brothers and sisters, you have to understand that you're dealing with spiritual symbolism. And if you don't understand you're dealing with spiritual symbolism, then you are going to be really, really sad when once again you get stood up when Jesus the Christ doesn't return. You're going to get stood up again. But the only way you're going to get stood up is because you think that this is literal. It is not a literal story. Let's flip around here for a second, so if we can.
With that, or you want to go back?
Yeah. Well, let me deal with that. We mentioned Horus, as he calls it, Anubis, Heru, Anpu, and Maat and Geb. Were they real characters? Because this is symbolism, we're talking about the way that you should live your life in order to be a vaunted ancestor. I do not actually believe that when I die, I'm literally going to see scales.
Right.
I don't believe that.
That you're going to see on poop.
That's right. And I don't believe that there was actually a dude with a bird head walking around or a dude with a jackal's head walking around. I'm not trying to cultivate my spiritual energy so I develop a bird head. That's not what I'm trying to do. It is spiritual symbolism. Your Kemetic ancestors, your African ancestors understood they were talking about spiritual symbolism. By the way, if you don't understand spiritual symbolism, does it mean that Jesus is a lamb? Is Jesus literally a barnyard animal. No, because now you understand spiritual symbolism when it suits you. But then you want to actually call my tradition BS, and he didn't use BS because I'm talking about a jackal which will meet me. By the way, you have to understand something else. In some of those books, some of these characters are different. If you read the myth, you'll see that sometimes they say that Re or Ra creates all of humanity. Other times they say Ptah creates all of humanity. If you know the stories well enough, I will ask you to read the creation story that comes from a city called Kemenu. Kemenu, please look it up. And in this story, we know that there are 4 pairs of twins that are in that inert water. And each of those twins, when you listen to the description, one of them is inertness, one of them is potential, one of them, when you begin to understand that, you understand they're talking about myth. By the way, your story is myth too. How do I know? Because you got it from Kemet. That's how I know it's myth. That's why the grandfather can tell you, grandchild, your story is sacred myth. But the problem is you're not listening to grandfather. You're not listening to grandmother. You are a child with a book and you're reading it for the first time. You have to re-Africanize your text. You have to understand from whence it comes. Because if you understand from whence it comes, some of the things that you're doing will be a higher vibrational energy. They'll be better. They'll be right. But because you're being so literal, you're having problems. Only the European is that literal, brother. I want you to read the book Jesus Wars. I keep giving it to you. In fact, in the debate that I had with Divine Prospect, you said you were going to get it. It's been more than a month now. Have you gotten it, brother Tazariak? Have you read it? I guarantee you the answer is no. You said you would. Get the book AD 381. Get the book Jesus Wars. Get those books, because you know what else you haven't done? You're not reading the history of the creation of the text. You're not reading the history of the creation of the institutions that gave you the text. All you're doing is reading the text. That's a problem, because people decided which text you would read, how those texts would be rendered, and who should read them. They also decided which books shouldn't be in those texts. The books that you're reading are not the only books that early Jews or early Christians were reading. There were other books. Why were those books not included? Well, part of the answer is that some of those traditions were either too mythological, they dealt with the power of the feminine too much. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, you have to look at you've heard me say this before. I don't know why you haven't dealt with the sister that actually baptizes along with Paul. Why don't you read that story? Read it. Because you'll begin to realize that some of those books were not included because, for whatever reason, those literalists did not think they'd be able to profit, did not be able to think that you'd be able to control with it. Because sometimes what you see is average people, even average women, are able to channel divine force. If they allowed you to believe that, you wouldn't be going to them to actually give them your sins. You wouldn't be going to them as an intermediary to the divine. And I know that you're saying, he's confusing us with the white Christians. Brother, that is where your tradition comes from. The people who were Hebrew Israelites weren't initially Jews. They came out of Christianity. So you have to understand that they took what they had and they tried to reinterpret some of it. They tried to read some other things a little bit differently, but they didn't go back and say, now we're going to look for the other books that weren't included. They didn't say we're going to look for the most authentic text, one that has not been tampered with. Do you know that we know that some of the biblical stories, some of the biblical books were tampered with? That we have earlier versions that have come forward recently that are different from the ones you have in your book. So how in the world could you just read what has been given to you? How in the world can you just read a book that your enslaver gave to you? You can't just read it with an accent or read it with a big line on your chest on the corner and think that you're doing something revolutionary. He already rigged the game against you. African, re-Africanize your tradition, re-Africanize your text. If you really want to throw off the tomhu, if you really want to throw off the yoke of the European, you have to go back to the source. If you go back to the source, you and I will stand back to back in our battles. Right now, I'm not even sure if I can entirely trust you because you think that you're closer to the European. You think that you are, that the African, me, by the way, is benighted, is cursed. As long as you think those things, listen, I agree with a lot of what you're doing in the community in the hood. I want to support what you're doing in the community in the hood, but I'm never sure if I can actually trust you. Because you don't know who he is. If you don't know who he is, how can you do what's good for us? That's what I'm getting at. And so that is what you have to understand. Now, in terms of spiritual symbolism, let me say this final thing and then we'll conclude. Yeah, you want to turn over here? Yeah. Now, some of you have seen this before. Some of you have seen me deal with the judgment scene before. And I know that Tazariak was mentioning this. He said, it's BS that you're going to see Anpu, he said Anubis, actually when you die. Why is this spiritual symbolism? Yeah, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. Listen, if you want to go through the whole thing, look at the video that Reggie and I did. Just look at it again. But I want to show you something. Can you see that you're being led in by Anpu? And that Anpu was also reading the scales? How is that possible? How is it possible that one person, one character, can be in more than one place? It's because we're dealing with spiritual symbolism. By the way, the person who made their transition is here, here, and here. This is the person that made their transition is here. By the way, if you read it this way, in this instance, this is in some ways something that happens in consecutive order. So it happens here that you go before the neteru and you tell them that you are worthy to go in, just because the majority of the audience might be familiar with it. But we would have called it the Hall of Maat. So you can go into those people who are doubly of Maat, doubly righteous. And they didn't agree. Some of them have ankhs on their knees and some of them do not. Now, because they didn't agree, you had to come down here with Anpu and have your heart weighed. So this is another scene right here. One scene, including Anpu issued twice, including Ma'at being a scale rather than a person. How could Ma'at be a scale here if Ma'at is not a mythological character? Right. How could a woman be the scale? By the way, here, if you are not righteous, your body is devoured by a beast known as Amut. Amut is a lion, is a crocodile, is a hippo. That being doesn't exist in the natural world. We're talking about sacred spiritual symbolism. It is important for you, beloved, to actually learn the greater teachings that are here. And when you learn the greater teachings, you're going to learn how to live a life according to Ma'at, a life according to balance, a life according to reciprocity, a life according to law, a life according to righteousness, a life according to order, a life according to all of those principles that will make you a divine character. And yes, you will also notice that here, after you are let in and your heart is lighter than a feather, when you get here with Heru, not Horus, Heru, the son of Asar, your name is actually rendered with your name and Asar. So now you have become the divine force. This is spiritual symbolism. How can you become divine, beloved? That is what your African ancestors were trying to tell you. Don't follow the lower vibration of a story of one guy that did something once. This is a story about how you can become divine now. This is your story, not someone else's story. That is how your biblical stories were. The majority of your Bible is myth. The majority of your Bible is myth. That's not an insult. Actually, if you understood what I was saying, I'm actually saying something positive to you. Because the story of myth will tell you how to do it, beloved. You can read history. By the way, I would love to be able to play basketball like Michael Jordan. I can read a newspaper and hear about what Michael Jordan did. That's history. If Michael Jordan was a myth, the story would be about how you could be like him. Let's not render our spiritual text as history, because what ends up happening is we take the spiritual power out of it. You are actually reading the lowest version of your spiritual text. It's not going to help you that way. Read the highest version of your spiritual text, and then perhaps you'll be able to enter the hall of the righteous ones.
Now, one last thing, and we got to deal with this.
Yes.
Hopefully, I know this ain't going to be the last time we cover it. We might have to do it on Kemet on trial, but we got to deal with the penises and all that again. Last time, man, once and for all, can you deal with the gab and the earth? Because it's like they still missing it, and I think they really want to miss it. They don't understand.
Now, I'm not going to deal with this in great detail, because just tomorrow we're going to be talking about some of these issues with Brother Michael Edwards, and I don't want to give him too much.
No, I ain't going to put it up until after.
Oh, so you're going to hear it afterwards.
Yeah.
Okay, so I want to be really clear. So many of you are uncomfortable with your human body, and that's because the European is uncomfortable with their human body. That's what it is. You are following the ways of an imitator who is imitating you. Ancient Africans didn't think the body was dirty. When you read our Pertem Heruan Ger, the book that has been misnomered the Book of the Dead, it actually tells you that every portion of your body is sacred, including your henenu, sometimes also called the henenum. That is the penis, the phallus. By the way, you can hear, if you're familiar with the terms, that those are not African terms for that portion of your body. So perhaps that's the problem. Maybe it's because you're looking for penises, so you're just finding European members, and you haven't looked at your own African member. Maybe that's why you have the problem that you have. But I want to be clear here that some people have some discomfort around some of the text where you actually see some of the divine characters using their divine member to create the world. And some people have said that it's homosexual. I'm not talking about you, Michael Edwards. Some people have said that it's sodomy. I am talking about you, Michael Edwards. And some people just say that it's a real brother, and this is not what Tadariak said. He used some colorful language. A real brother would never live with that. You got to understand the reason why you're doing that is not because when you look at it that way, you're not a real brother. Maybe you're a child. Maybe you can't see your physical body in its real sense. I would think the children of Kemet come to this with more maturity than you do as a grown man. And that's a sad thing. That's a really sad thing. Your body is a divine entity. Now let's go back to spiritual symbolism again. If you hear that a character is actually putting their seed in their mouth, you have to understand that we're talking about Ra in one instance. What is Ra, family? You know what Ra is. Ra is the power, the divine power of the sun. You know this. In fact, when you go outside and you see a shaft of light coming down and you say that's a sun ray, you better recognize that you're actually describing what's happened according to the deity that your Kemetic ancestors used. That's why you call it a ray, because you're talking about Re or Ra, the sun deity. So you may think that you're not down with Kemet, but every single time you use that word, you're giving power to a Kemetic deity. So if you're hearing that Re copulated with himself, first of all, you have to understand that that is not always rendered as copulate. Sometimes it says united with himself. And you have to understand that what they're actually saying is that Ra is so powerful that he can create entirely. But here's the challenge I have for you. In our tradition, you will see that creation occurs with the male energy and the female energy. That's the only way that creation can occur. If you're confused about that, go ask your mother. Ask her how you were created, because maybe you're confused about that because you don't know how it works. I'm assuming that that also must mean that the women in your tradition must be unsatisfied because you're so confused about how this happens. Tell them to come to Kemet. So let me say to you really clearly that we're talking about male and female. And so that's why you hear that in some of the stories, either it's Atum or it's Ra or it's Ptah takes his seed into his hand. His hand becomes female. We're not talking about an actual physical being. They don't prescribe to human laws. We're talking about energy. And so even when you're talking about a male entity, by the way, the male energy occurs in something very different. Males create structures. Females create matter. They have to work together in order to develop and create the world, right? And so that's the reason why we use Re as a male entity, because we're talking about the structure of the universe. But there can be no female because there can be no female because matter can't be created. I'm talking so deep that it's over some of y'all heads. But you have to be able to read the text and understand that this is a deeper story. By the way, I'm telling you a story that you probably wouldn't even understand until you had several years of study in the Kemetic temple. So if you don't get it, it just means you're not ready yet.
Let me ask you this.
And let me finish though. So in that instance, the hand is female. In that other instance, the mouth is female. But you have to understand that in your tradition, it says that your deity spoke a word and the word created the world. The mouth in this instance is talking about your will, your ability to create what you say. Your ability to actually define the world with your words. If you were a divine being, you would be able to do that. You know how in the hood brothers say, my word is born? That's what they're talking about. Your word is born. How does something get born? You have to understand that these traditions are ancient African traditions. And I know you're uncomfortable with them because you think that your henanu or your henanum is dirty. You think your penis is dirty. You think your female's vagina is dirty. That's the reason why in your tradition you have an immaculate conception, because sex must be dirty. It's also the reason why one of my Hebrew Israelite brothers told me that when his wife is having her menses, she can't sleep in the bed with him. So you have to understand that you have to stop thinking of the body that the inter created as dirty. And as long as you think of it that way, you're going to see fornication, you're going to see sodomy, you're going to see all those things. And all they're saying is that you have to have male and female energy to create. By the way, if you're uncomfortable with that and you want to call that tradition gay, which doesn't make any sense because we're talking about one being creating from itself, then how don't you ask how your three male characters in your story create? You have the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which in your tradition you describe as gay today. It wasn't always described as gay, but that's because you're not reading anything else, so you don't know that. It wasn't always described as male, I should say. And so you have three males creating. Is that not homosexual? What does homosexual mean? If you have three males that can create the universe, that's homosexual. So you don't understand what you are saying. You're not ready. Read some more, study some more, meditate. Join into the spiritual tradition so you can understand the highest story that your ancestors left for you.
Okay, and last question. I have heard Captain Tazariak, Michael Edwards, and a host of other Hebrews. They will say things like, oh, if you defend that story, then you gotta be gay, and how you gonna tell that to your children? But what about the story of the brother going around collecting foreskins? You see what I'm saying? How come y'all not telling that story? So now, if you believe that story and you trying to defend it, then what that say? By your own logic, you gotta be gay. Come on, man.
Let's be really clear. The only people that are saying that don't think that we read their Bible. And this is the reason why I said to Michael Edwards that he needed to be really cautious, because I was raised a Christian. I went to Christian Catholic school. What does that mean? It means that I actually studied the history of the church. There were some things I heard in high school that I had never heard before. I would go home and tell my parents. They would say, that's not true. And I would say, no, I heard it from a priest who went to seminary. In fact, he teaches priests in seminary. One time, my parents actually called them to talk to them, and that priest instructed them on the history of the church. Why didn't they know it? Because they only read the Bible. I'm talking about my own family who I love dearly. They don't know the history. They don't know when the books were written. They don't know who wrote them. They don't know how long it took to write them all. All they're reading is that one book. They don't know the history. And so that is one of the major problems that we have. I'm going to tell you, though, that I read that book at least 4 times. I went to Catholic school. If you're so uncomfortable with the henanu, the penis, then tell us why one of your greatest patriarchs, David, went to collect 200 foreskins of the Philistines after he slew them, and had to give them to Saul in order to receive his bride. Tell me why that happens. Are you uncomfortable with that? There are a lot of stories in the Bible. I can't even go through the litany, because we'd be here for a long time. No one reads their text in its literal form. Are you teaching your children that story? How about the story of how Lot, who was confronted by an angry, lustful, raping mob, wanted to rape the angels that had come to visit him in his home? And in order to protect them, what does he do? Now, I don't even know why I'm saying this, because some of the people who are watching this know the story. He says, I have some virgin daughters. You want them? How about you deal with that story? And then even Michael Edwards has the nerve, the unmitigated gall, to speak ill of his ancestors and say something that didn't happen. He says incest happened in Kemet. We have mothers sleeping with their sons. First of all, brother, why don't you find me an instance where you have a record of a mother sleeping with her son? I'm waiting. I could wait all day, because you're not going to find one. Keep looking. That's not how the matrilineal line of succession occurred. Often what happened is half sisters and half brothers were married. Now, you might disagree with it today. If you disagree with it today, let's go back to your friend Lot. How about the fact that his daughters intoxicated him, gave him wine so he would be drunk, so they could actually have intercourse with him and take his seed? You are in trouble, because I know your text way better than you know mine. He just said to me today, well, this happened during the Ptolemaic period. And I said, no, brother, that's the Ptolemaic period.
Right.
Because you haven't read enough. They haven't read enough to be able to understand the traditions. By the way, I don't expect you to. You know why? Because I am the grandparent instructing the grandchild. So there's no way that you're going to come to this story as well as I do. I don't care how many books you read. By the way, I think Michael Edwards has only read the Egyptian Book of the Dead by Faulkner. And he thinks that he sees things that are unusual in it. That's the only thing you've read. I'm telling you that it's symbolism. Listen, there's a lot, and I'm going to go through a bunch of them, and you are going to be red-faced. I know you're a brother with melanin. You're going to still be red-faced, because you have to recognize that, first of all, if you think that we shouldn't teach that to children, then why don't you I think you have kids. I want you to talk to me about when you told, I hope you have a daughter, because this is going to make it even more uncomfortable. Why don't you see how I talk to children about the henanum of Asar, and I want to see a video how you talk about to your daughters about them raping their father to take his seed. Let's do that together and see who's in a more difficult situation. You have to understand, brother, that first of all, nobody reads the full source of their spiritual text to someone who is uninitiated, whether they're a child or they're you. Someone who is uninitiated. No one does, because these things have to be experienced as you reach a certain level of maturity. Not everything is read to everyone at all times, but I would not be uncomfortable talking to children about the power of seed and how the world was created in this manner. I wouldn't be uncomfortable with that. I'm sure you would be uncomfortable with Lot, especially because you're so literal that you think that Lot is a real person. I'm going to tell you right off the bat that Ra is not a real person. That Ra is a spiritual character describing the way that vital energy occurs in the world. I'm going to tell you that Asar is not a real person. This is to you too, Tazariak. Asar was not a person that lived. Asar is a deity that describes how energy occurs on the physical plane and then goes into the other traditions. If you're uncomfortable with it, then you must be uncomfortable with your tradition, because you better know that Asar is an archetype for your Jesus. You better believe that when you say Jesus Christ, that Christ is not even a Christian term, that it's a Kemetic term. You better understand that these two ladies that are standing with Asar are called the beloved ones. In the Kemetic tradition, they would have been called the Mary. You wonder why there are two Marys in your story about Jesus? That's because they got it from Ast, who was doubly beloved, and they got it from Inbet-Het, who was doubly beloved. They were the Marys. In your tradition, that woman should be called Miriam. Why is she called by a nickname and she's the most important woman in the tradition? Because they're trying to tell you we are retelling an older story according to our social mores. You have to open your lens to receive more information in order to be powerful, Brother Tazariak. You have to open your lens. In fact, Brother Michael Edwards, you have to remove the lens cover in order to see more information so you're able to come to this with greater spiritual symbolism. And the vile things that you're saying vile things that you're saying about yourself. You're not even insulting me. You just don't know it. You're insulting us. That's what you're doing. I pray that there is a day that you'll realize your error. And as you realize your error, you're going to come back home and understand that your tradition is the most powerful tradition in the world. That's why everyone imitated it. That's why the Hebrew people wrote themselves into it, even though now we know they weren't even there. That's why they did it, because your tradition is powerful. And when you go against your African ancestors, you will lose. You have the weak hand here, brother. Any of you can come and debate me. As long as the debate is respectful, as long as you're going to just be talking out your mind, as long as we are able to speak for a time that is fair and equitable, you're going to lose. And you're going to lose because you have the weak hand. You can't come against your ancestors and think you're going to prosper. Even your book tells you that you have to honor thy mother and thy father. Well, I'm the African. You're looking at your father right now. So you had better honor our traditions or you will lose.